In Radical Transformational Leadership, Monica Sharma makes a good point. In the corporate and business world, plans and their implementation include outcomes, outputs, and inputs, but not impacts. Very few corporations and businesses relate to impacts which are result-based on equitable and sustainable outcomes. This phenomenon limits the purpose, contribution, scope, and horizon of business endeavors. I wanted to concentrate on that word, purpose. This phenomenon limits the purpose of business endeavors. In ethics, as we said before, Aristotle talks about what the Greeks called the telos, the purpose of a thing. Once you forget the telos, the machine goes haywire. I mean, would you buy a refrigerator that forgot that its telos was to keep your food cold? Would you buy a fridge that allowed your food to get warm? The problem with the wider economy is that economists have, in many ways, forgotten the telos of their industry. In her book, Donut Economics, Kate Raworth expressed frustration at this fact and how it's sending the world off kilter. In the 20th century, the field of economics lost its desire to articulate its goals, she writes. She illustrates this fact by citing how when Xenophon coined the term economics, he offered a definition of it which bodied forth its telos. Namely, he described economics as the practice of household management. Aristotle shared Xenophon's definition, distinguishing economics from chrematistics, which is the study of the creation of wealth, a distinction that seems all but lost today, comments Raworth. Raworth then documents how the definition of economics stayed relatively steady since antiquity. For instance, in 1767, a Scottish economist named James Stewart articulated the telos of the science, writing, "The principal object of this science is to secure a certain fund of subsistence for all the inhabitants, to obviate every circumstance which may render it precarious, to provide everything necessary for supplying the wants of the society, and to employ the inhabitants, supposing them to be free men, in such a manner as to naturally create reciprocal relations and dependencies between them, so as to make their several interests lead them to supply one another with their reciprocal wants." A decade later, Adam Smith offered his own definition, agreeing with Stewart that economics was a goal-oriented science, i.e., a field of inquiry guided by a telos. He wrote, "It has two distinct objects, to supply a plentiful revenue or subsistence for the people, or more properly, to enable them to provide such a revenue or subsistence for themselves, and secondly, to supply the state or commonwealth with a revenue sufficient for public services." This started to metamorphose somewhat when 70 years later, John Stuart Mill weighed in, writing, "A science which traces the laws of such of the phenomena of society as arise from the combined operations of mankind for the production of wealth." With this, Mill kicked off a trend of shifting the focus away from describing the goal of economics, i.e., helping people, to concentrating more on its apparent laws, especially those related to wealth creation, irrespective of their connection to actual individuals. In 1932, Lionel Robbins of the London School of Economics expressed frustration that economics as a field had lost all definitional precision, i.e., its telos, offering his own insights, saying, "We all talk about the same things, but we have not yet agreed what it is we're talking about." He added, "Economics is the science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means, which have alternative uses." That definition seemed to hold sway for most of the 20th century. Many mainstream textbooks still use some variant of Robbins' definition. Kate Raworth says, "But although it frames economics as a science of human behavior, it spends little time inquiring into those ends, let alone into the nature of the scarce means involved." Raworth draws attention to the trend when she cites Gregory Mankiw's widely used textbook Principles of Economics, where the definition has become economics is the study of how society manages its scarce resources. Raworth adds, "It erases the question of ends or goals from the page altogether," adding, "The discussion of the economy's goals simply disappeared from view." This trend reached a crescendo after Milton Friedman, who actually applauded the removal of goals from the field of economics, writing, "A demonstration that economics had become a value-free zone, shaking off any normative claims of what ought to be, and emerging at last as a positive science focused on describing simply what is." This last remark summed up a quote by Immanuel Kant. Namely, the anthropologist describes the world as it is. The ethicist describes the world as it ought to be. By Friedman depegging economics from what ought to be, he was decoupling it from ethics, a complaint that Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen aired when he said, "It's like trying to steer a course without a reliable compass." Indeed, a system that has lost sight of its telos, of its goal, would also of necessity have lost sight of its conscience. For the telos is the conscience of the system, the model which helps the system stay on track. Like the example of the thermostat on a heating system. The thermostat is of the utmost importance because it tells the system what the ideal temperature is. That ideal is the archetype, the model, the telos. The closer you get to that telos, the archetype, the more that you can say that the system is closer to perfection. For as Spinoza says, I shall mean by good that which we certainly know to be a means of approaching more nearly to the type. Any system that loses track of its telos would, metaphorically speaking, lose sight of its conscience. In the succeeding presentations, we'll examine the issues related to a system which has lost sight of its purpose, which has forgotten that the telos was to create a system to serve people, and not people to serve a system, and which has even lost sight of what true wealth is in the first place. The New American Magazine is now on Locals. It's a for-pay platform for like $5. It gives you access to extra content and allows you to support your favorite hosts. As I said before, think of it like throwing some coins into the cup of a street performer. Check it out at thenewamerican.locals.com.